And I would ask those Michelle Obama students, if you want to sit down, we absolutely would love to have you to take a seat. All of the people that we invited are here. So there are some vacant seats. And for the other young people, I know you can last a little while for this hearing. Let me formally bring our Committee on Homeland Security to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on immigration raids, impacts, and aftermath in Mississippi communities. I'm very proud to welcome my colleagues today, not only to my home state and the 2nd Congressional District of Mississippi, but I'm also glad to welcome you to my alma mater, Tougaloo College, where I got started 1 or 2 years ago, involved in voter registration, civil rights, and doing a lot of things throughout the Mississippi Delta. Tougaloo was at the center of the civil rights movement in Mississippi and helped set the stage for activism that changed the direction of our country. The college is a fitting venue for the Committee on Homeland Security to meet today to examine the recent immigration raids and their effect on Mississippi families, children, and communities. 3 months ago, on August 7th, 2019, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement sent hundreds of agents to Mississippi to arrest nearly 700 workers at 7 chicken processing plants across the state. It was the largest statewide workplace raid in the U.S. history, with 680 community members arrested. Far from being hardened criminals or posing a public safety hazard, those arrested were trying to provide for their families, send their children to school, and build a life free from violence, crime, and poverty at home. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of these raids is the way ICE failed to take into account that children would be left without one or both parents as a result. Hundreds of children, by some estimates, over 1,000 children were directly affected by the raids. Children finished their first day of school only to find that there was no one to pick them up or no one waiting for them at home. Schools, social service, and entire communities had to scramble to try to find separated children. In the town of Forest, Mississippi, strangers and neighbors brought crying children to a community gym where the owner had offered them a place to sleep. Bedding and food was donated until children could be united with their parents, or in some cases, extended families. The day after the raids, ICE believed that all children were reunited with at least one parent. Sadly, we know this is not the case. We know of a single mother who remained in ICE custody even though her 3 minor children are being cared for by an unrelated neighbor. In some cases, it appears both parents or single parents could be deported. But what happened to the children? Will families be forced to send children back to a country they never seen or speak the language or grow up without any parents? What happens when the children are U.S. citizens? Because of the way this operation was carried out, our communities are living in fear. People are afraid to leave their homes. Children are terrified to go to school because they may return home to find their remaining parent gone, and local businesses are suffering. I want to take a moment to share a few words recorded by a girl whose father was arrested in the raids.
I'm a girl from Clergy, Mississippi, and I'm studying Lake Central High School. So the day of the raid, it was like a normal day at school, and then next thing you know, I got a text message, and then I didn't read the message just until I got my phone back, and then I saw that they got my dad at first, and at first I really didn't believe they got my dad, and then when I realized that they were telling the truth, that's when I kind of broke down, and then I just had to think of the stuff, what's going on,
Well,
and
we got a
then
little technical difficulty. We're
I
going to
had
move forward.
I just felt like it was my
Uh,
fault at that day.
Adam, it's hard to
Yeah.
understand it. So we'll just, but that's a 15-year-old young lady who was describing the impact of what the raids did to her and how she is still suffering personally from it. The other relatives, adult in the home, is afraid to come out of the home for fear of being picked up. So it's a real challenge a lot of families are facing. Uh, Clearly, families are still suffering from these recent raids. However, none of the employers have experienced any legal consequences yet. Mike Hurst, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Mississippi, has stated, to those who use illegal aliens for a competitive advantage or to make a quick buck, we have something to say to you. If we find you have violated criminal law, we are coming for you. And yet, not one employer or person from management has been arrested. No one has been charged. In fact, prosecution of companies who hire undocumented workers have declined compared to previous administration numbers. The selective way the administration is enforcing our laws is disappointing. Today, we're joined by witnesses from all walks of life who will share their perspectives about what happened on August 7th, what has happened in the aftermath of the raids, and what can be done to help those who are still suffering as a result. I hope to also hear from our witnesses about how we can help ensure the mistakes ICE made during the recent raids are not repeated here in Mississippi or elsewhere in the country. I support immigration reform to ensure that employers can hire the workers they need and good people who want to work to support their families will have a way to do so. In the meantime, I'm committed to ensuring that the Department of Homeland Security enforce the laws in keeping our values and exercise discretion where necessary to protect children and other vulnerable populations. Again, I want to thank Tougaloo College for hosting us and look forward to this productive hearing. Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Let me introduce my colleagues who are here. To my right, your left, is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from Houston, Texas. To my left is Congressman Al Green from Houston, Texas. To his left, and from I call South Mississippi, sometimes known as Memphis, Tennessee, my colleague Congressman Cohen from Memphis, Tennessee. And so I welcome our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. Cliff Johnson, is director of the Roderick and Sonage MacArthur Justice Center and a member of the faculty at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Our next witness, Reverend Odell Medina, is the pastor of St. Anne's Catholic Church in Carthage, Mississippi. In response to raids, Father Odell turned his parish into a makeshift legal and counseling center for affected families. Our next witness, the Honorable Constance Iona Slaughter Harvey, is the founder and president of the board of the Legal Education and Community Empowerment Foundation. She's a native of Forest. She's also a judge, a graduate of Tougaloo College, who also has the distinction of being the first African American female to graduate from the University of Mississippi Law School. So our last witness is Miss Lorena. You're going to have to help me out now. Kitos Lewis is the lead organizer for the Mississippi Immigrant Coalition and Working Together Mississippi, which was instrumental in providing support and aid to families affected by the Mississippi ICE raids. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Congressman Thompson. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I first want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about these unprecedented raids that occurred on August 7 here in Mississippi. I've practiced law here for 27 years. I've represented thousands of clients. Nothing I have ever done has impacted me like the work I've been involved in on behalf of the more than 1,000 people impacted by the largest workplace raids in United States history. I have sat face to face with dozens and dozens of people who have told me, often through tears, about their fears, their concerns, the dreams they had for their families, and I am struck repeatedly by the extent to which they are vulnerable and confused and scared, and I am left to ask the question, why? Why this? Why here? Why in Mississippi? And I want to focus my remarks on two areas today. One, I want to make clear that these raids were not carried out in response to any outcry from people here in Mississippi. We did not ask for this. Secondly, I want to address the fact that more than 100 of the people detained in those raids have been charged criminally. They've been indicted by the United States Department of Justice and this United States Attorney for felonies. In addition to the other administrative matters that they face, the immigration court cases, the civil fines that have been imposed, they now must run the gauntlet of federal felony prosecution at the hands of this Department of Justice. First, I will say, Latino immigrant workers have been involved in the poultry industry in Mississippi for more than 20 years. We know our neighbors and friends. We know them from public schools and from soccer fields and from our places of business and from shared places of worship. If you talk to local law enforcement officials, and you will hear from one today, you will learn that these people are not a threat to our communities. They're certainly not a threat to national security. They have become vital parts of the community. They are people who we know, and they are people about whom we care. I think it is important to note that even under the regime imposed by the Trump administration, where the focus is said to be on those people who present a threat, that this group of people detained on August 7th come nowhere close to meeting the objectives or the criteria identified for enforcement. I do not know how this state, where immigrants make up less than 2% of the population, where there's been no outcry from the community, was chosen as the epicenter of enforcement action, but I can tell you that Mississippi is not better off as a result of what has happened here. I must, as a former Assistant United States Attorney, also focus on the actions of the United States Attorney here in prosecuting nearly 120 people. Prosecutorial discretion is at the heart of our system. Prosecutors must make decisions about how to use the resources made available to them, the substantial resources made available to them, and deciding who should be prosecuted and who should not. It is such an important part of our system that the Department of Justice discusses it at length in its Justice Manual. And in my written remarks that you received, you can see my analysis as to why the prosecutorial discretion exercised in this case, in my opinion, is terribly flawed. This does not serve a substantial federal interest, and there certainly are alternative means of remedy in this context. It's important to note that this U.S. Attorney's Office recently, in response to another raid that involved almost 600 people, criminally prosecuted only 9 people. And the U.S. Attorney at the time said, this prosecution of employers, as Congressman Thompson highlighted, is in line with the department's emphasis on prosecuting employers, not employees. Prosecuting employees is hardly a deterrent to companies bent on ignoring the law. That's from the same United States Attorney's Office. U.S. Attorney Hurst was an assistant U.S. attorney in this case. Former Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly, speaking of President Trump's executive order in 2017, assured us that just being in the United States isn't enough. In his words, it's got to be something else. In Mississippi, in these raids, there was nothing else. These people are not criminals. There is no record of violent behavior. Of the people being prosecuted, many of them are young mothers with a third-grade education or less who have themselves been victimized by crimes. They are only a handful that have even a misdemeanor conviction. These prosecutions are wrong-headed, and they're a wrong use of our resources. And I would encourage the committee to look hard at the prospect of duplication of these types of raids and prosecutions as a misuse of resources at the Department of Justice and as unfair and inhumane piling on in the context of people who are here working hard, being law-abiding neighbors and friends. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Father Odell to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Father Odell Medina, a Catholic priest who belongs to the Order of Missionary Servants of the Most Holy Trinity and pastor of St. Anne Catholic Church in Carthage. This parish is located in the Diocese of Jackson, where Bishop Joseph Kopax is the leader. First of all, I would like to thank the representative of Homeland Security Committee, as well as Chairman Bennett Thompson and Ranking Member Mike Rogers, for the opportunity to give my testimony. My testimony is about the impact due to the raids that occurred August 7, 2019 in the community of Carthage. This community has been deeply affected because there are in Carthage many members of the Hispanic community that were working in the chicken plants where the raids took place. These people, I can personally attest, are hard workers who contribute to the local, state, and national economy. These are people of family, they are people of faith, and they pay their taxes. Many of them have lived in the United States 5 years or more. Almost of them have children that are citizens of the United States. Children that are suffering from separation from their families due for their parents either being deported or are still in the detention center pending the deportation process. The trauma of these children is too painful. They do not understand why their parents have been arrested. They said, "My parents are not criminals. They are not bad people. They were working. Why does immigration put them in jail?" I have with me a letter and a picture from 2 children whose father is still in detention center. I have permission to share this with you today. The older 13-year-old son wrote a letter begging the judge to release his father by bail. His father is someone that has been in the United States for 19 years old. Allow me to highlight part of the letter, and let me tell you today, ironically, this father going to present in front of the judge. The letter said, "Dear Judge, I hope you understand me. My dad is a good, hard-working that loves to love with us and loves to go to church. For us and for my grandparents, he usually works extra for us and my grandparents for food and supplies. I don't want him to leave me by myself with my mom and brother because it won't be a complete family without him. He was always there for me when I was sad. He made me laugh. He also helped me with my math homework. When I didn't understand it, he was my best friend that always played with me. So please, can give us a bail for my dad. We are so sad without him because as soon as we came home from school the day when the police caught my dad, we were waiting for him, and then he called me on my phone and he said, 'Don't be sad, but the ICE policeman had caught me. Pray for me, please.' That's when I started to cry aloud, that I started to pray with all my heart and feelings. So please let me dad be a citizen here because I need his love and careness with me. Thank you for reading this letter that I wrote with my heart. That God bless you on everything you do and have." This is just one simple example of the reality of many families, but also representatives. I believe this race called national attention to urgent necessity to reform the immigration system. And the proof is that you are here as well. So let me tell you also this part of my testimony. When people heard about the race, they started calling me from all over the United States, people from many races and religions, like Jewish people in Florida, that told me that they know what it means to be under persecution and segregation. They said, please let me help. African American people told me, Father Odell, we know what it means to be segregated in the past. People from Chicago, California, and Virginia called me to say, Father Odell, this is not right. We need to do something. How can we help? You can help me with money assistance, I told them, but the best help is to change the immigration system. This is a phenomenon that people are aware that we need to do something. This new generation of citizens, the children of this family, will never forget the ones that helped them and their families. This is a national outcry, and I believe many of these decisions are in your hands. I pray to God to give you the wisdom to address this issue in the right way. In conclusion, thank you again for giving me the opportunity to express my testimony on behalf of these people that are crying out for help. And I assure you my prayer, because I know this is not easy to handle. God bless you.
Thank you very much. Very powerful testimony. We now recognize Judge Slaughter Harvey to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Congressman Thompson, and appreciate the presence of the other members of Congress. As a native Mississippian and as a longtime resident, I have seen changes in the political and legal system. I witnessed African Americans beaten and degraded for exercising basic rights as Americans. And shortly after my graduation, I filed lawsuits on behalf of victims and their families for brutality, beatings, and even death inflicted at the hands of police officers and other law enforcement personnel. While we were not successful in many of these legal actions, I always hoped we served notice on the law enforcement officials. But in recent years, and more recently in recent months, it seems a notice was apparently not received. I appreciate your description of what happened in my hometown of Forest following the raids. But not only were the employees who were arrested surprised and caught off guard, most in the Forest and Morton communities of Scott County were actually surprised and quite disturbed. The manner in which the raids was conducted was appalling and inhumane, to say the least. The poultry workers were treated as terrorists and animals. That upsets me. But local law enforcement officers, as you will hear today, were themselves unaware of the raids, and many expressed disappointment with the lack of notice. When I first learned of the ICE raids, my heart dropped as I felt heat in my nose. I contacted CPS officials, that's Children Protective Services officials, and I represent that agency in Scott County. Our concern was what was happening to the children. I was advised the day after that nobody in CPS in Scott County knew about the raids. There was no notice for state employees to take care of these children. I was contacted by individuals who are beneficiaries of Legacy, our program. And one of the ladies called and said that she needed me to come over and talk to her child. When I went over, he ran up to me and said, "Miss Connie, why do they hate my mama?" The only thing I could do was grab him and tell him that his mother was loved. My grandson, who's with me today, was also affected. He was in tears because one of the boys whose mother was arrested is his best friend. He sees what this country is coming to and there's no exception for an infliction of pain on children. I am, and probably will remain, disturbed. My church, St. Michael's Catholic Church in Forest, was torn apart. At least 200 of our parishioners are still detained. That should not happen in America. I don't want to get personal. I have submitted my comments to this panel, but there are many questions posed by community residents concerning the timing of the raids, the secrecy of the raids, the lack of plan and coordination of action, and the lack of compassion for the children whose families have been destroyed. The efforts to terrorize certain citizens has been successful. They are now intimidated, afraid, and angry. These raids disrupted so many lives in my community, and for that I am extremely resentful. Many families have been destroyed and probably will never recover. I am saddened that our children were subjected to this type of Gestapo action. Gentlemen and lady, what a damning and shaming indictment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Gentlelady Ms. Lewis to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and members of the House Homeland Security Committee for the opportunity to testify today and for holding this field hearing here in Mississippi to shine a light on the devastating impacts of the August worksite raids. My name is Lorena Quiroz, and I'm the Immigration Project Lead Organizer with Working Together Mississippi. I've been working along with many others to support families in crisis in response to the aftermath of the raids. 3 months later, this work is ongoing. Today I'm sharing a few stories from impacted individuals and families. Many of these individuals could not be here today with us, some because they're afraid and some because they're still in detention, but their stories must be told. August 7, 2019 was the first day of school in Mississippi. We heard the news that ICE detained 680 people at poultry plants in the central part of the state and sprung into action. Many kids would return home from school to find one or both of their parents gone that day. For those who were detained in the raids, recounting the brutality of the officers is painful. One individual said, "We were treated like animals. We were told we weren't coming back home. Why do they hate us so much?" Another woman was in her car when an ICE officer approached her. He forcibly removed her from the car after cutting her seatbelt with a knife and then threw her on the ground. She begged the officer to let her call her children, but he moved her inside with the rest of the detained workers. After the chaos of the raids, people were transferred to detention centers in the region. The story of a woman who I'll refer to as L demonstrates the many issues in detention, from language access to treatment of detainees. L is still detained 3 months later despite having 3 children at home who are in the care of a neighbor. L speaks Mum, one of 3 ancient dialects that many of those detained speak. She speaks just a little Spanish. She did not understand the questions that were asked during the raid. She was detained in Mississippi and then transferred to Louisiana. Her health has deteriorated. She eats only once a day and is in constant pain due to a chronic ailment. When I went to visit her with her children, her 5-year-old didn't recognize her and was afraid to speak to her. Families continue to scramble to find their loved ones. Over half of the persons detained were released. Others were sent to 2 detention centers in Mississippi and Louisiana. We began the search for the detained by conducting intakes, but noticed that days later, we weren't able to trace these detainees. More detention centers began popping up. Individuals detained went from being held into 2 detention centers to now spread across 13 different detention centers, hours apart. The trauma that these raids have caused is something that will outlast even the legal cases. Children did not sleep for days after the raids and still cry every night because their mom is not there to put them to sleep. I know a teenager who missed several days of school due to her anxiety and depression, teased by classmates about her family being deported. There's a great need for counseling and trauma-informed care, but our mental health system is not equipped to handle these cases. We have very limited capacity, and there's only one bilingual licensed trauma counselor in the entire state. One. She's working around the clock to provide services and to train licensed clinicians that are not bilingual on trauma or cultural competency, while also trying to get them interpreters. This community and these families are hardworking and proud people. They often work 10 to 12 hours a day, enduring horrendous working conditions. Workers tell stories of sexual harassment, lack of bathroom breaks, and child labor. Many of these families have been a part of our community for years, even decades. They've purchased homes, cars, opened up bank accounts, planned rodeos, attended church, held quinceañeras, even became business owners. We can address the immediate crisis before us caused by the anti-immigration policy of the current administration. This work must be done while we continue to create new and welcoming immigration policies that effectively put people on a pathway to citizenship and create safe and better paying working environments. What needs to happen next? Individuals detained should be released and reunited with their families. The government should immediately provide documentation on the whereabouts of all still in detention. Additional funding and resources for mental and other health-related issues are needed. A long-term crisis fund should be established with public and private dollars. We must end worksite raids and enforcement activities that tear families apart. Congress must hold DHS and ICE accountable for its actions and fight to hold the line against DHS' growing budget. Money for enforcement activity only results in the devastation of our communities and lasting trauma. Our families deserve to be united and free in their own communities. Chairman Thompson, if we work together to address these issues, we can move forward and build a welcoming community in Mississippi. La lucha sigue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank the witnesses. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I remind each member that he will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Johnson, given your work in the U.S. Attorney's Office and the work with these families, is your testimony here that there was some discretionary authority that could have been exercised with respect to this raid?
It is, Congressman Thompson. The Department of Justice publishes a justice manual recognizing that we don't prosecute cases criminally in each instance where there may be a technical violation of the law. And they provide specific guidance that makes clear that simply because a government lawyer believes a crime may have been committed, and even if they believe they can prove it in a court of law, the manual says that the prosecution must also serve a substantial federal interest, and they must assess whether there's an adequate non-criminal alternative to prosecution. Prosecutorial discretion in our system is vitally important. U.S. Attorney Hurst said in the aftermath of these raids that we're a country of immigrants, but we're also, and more than that, a country of laws, as if he and the Department of Justice had no choice but to prosecute every matter they thought might be a violation. That is not the case. To the extent that that is what he intended to communicate, the Department of Justice Justice Manual speaks to the contrary.
Father Medina, can you give this committee your experience in contacting or attempting to contact ICE on behalf of some of the families that you were working with?
Well, the day of the race, I tried to reach them to see where the people were, and I didn't have any exit. Because actually, nobody knew where the people were. We went to the office, ICE, Homeland Security office here in Jackson. Nobody were there, so I didn't have any result trying to reach them.
So your testimony is that at the day of the raid, those individuals who might have had an interest in what was going on didn't have anybody to talk to.
No, I went to the office of Homeland Security in Pearl and was locked. So they moved to someplace else, I believe in airport or army facility, and they have the people. So
Ms. Harvey, as I understand it, part of the requirement or the protocol is that, and we'll get to it with our next panel, but ICE officials are supposed to like notify school districts, human service people that they are preparing this. This was the first day of school. So are you aware of any notification that occurred in Scott County?
I am aware that it did not occur. Several employees at the Mississippi Department of Children's Services, Children's Protective Service, were caught off guard, were absolutely shocked. In fact, their supervisors were not notified. The principals and the superintendents in 5 public schools in Scott County, one went on television and stated that he had absolutely no knowledge of what happened, and his efforts to contact someone responsible, those efforts were in vain.
So basically, those children in the custody of the school district at the time of the raids, the school district didn't know what was going on.
No idea, no idea. And what happened is that because of the confusion, the students whose parents were arrested did not come to school the next day.
Yeah.
They were traumatized.
Mr. Johnson, you wanted to say something?
I did not, Your Honor.
So, Ms. Lewis, can you give the committee some of your experience with trying to make contact with ICE on behalf of some of the people we're talking about here today?
Many of the problems arose because of the language barrier. A lot of people assumed that the folks that were arrested spoke Spanish, but their language, it's a different language. They speak at least 3 or 4 different languages. So reaching out to us, even that in itself was a little bit complicated, and there are no interpreters that speak the indigenous language here in the state of Mississippi. So that was difficult trying to find. We also had intakes done, and then as they moved around in detention centers, we just kept losing people. We couldn't trace anyone.
Thank you very much. I'll yield to the gentlelady from Houston for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me thank you for holding this probably one of the most significant hearings that the Homeland Security Committee has held, and it is attributable to your leadership, and I'm grateful to be in your community at this time. It is very difficult to assess and to provide my outrage in a short period of time. But let me say that this is one of the most, or maybe the most, cruel and inhumane forms of government action that I have seen in a very, very long time. I'm so grateful for the astute leadership of all of you as panels, and certainly I want to acknowledge the leadership of Dr. Constance Slaughter Harvey, because she captured the connection of how the criminal justice system can be used as it relates to colored people, and we become the product of that system. Mass incarceration is an example, lynching is an example of the use of one's race or background to oppress them. So let me quickly get to my questions and say that I hope out of this hearing many of us have proposed a variety of remedies, but let me try to go to Mr. Johnson. If I don't get to all of you, I'm very grateful, Father Medina, for your leadership. I come from the Houston-Galveston Diocese, and we are always engaged in these issues, dealing with our brothers and sisters. But let me specifically go to you, Mr. Johnson, Professor Johnson, former U.S. Attorney. There's something about value when you get into a case. Could be a DEA raid where you shut down a major cartel linkage, or a major meth operation, and you assess the value. 680 workers, 303 of them were released. That's almost half that didn't need to be arrested at all, to be honest. And 32 of those 303 individuals, including 18 minors, were released on site. Tell me if you, in your work, would analyze the effectiveness of that kind of raid as it relates to resources and relates to results. And I want to get to Ms. Quirez-Lewis, so if you could very quickly. So when we as the federal government give money to the DOJ, this is wasteful. Those who might have been relevant as a danger to the community could have been picked up if they were known to be workers quietly at home or at work. Mr. Johnson.
Congresswoman Jackson Lee, all I'll say is you're absolutely right. I find this a shocking use of DOJ resources. They brought in 600 federal agents, Congresswoman, to arrest 680 people. The amount of money spent, the manpower committed to arresting people who have been working in these communities for years and decades, have been law-abiding citizens, is troubling. There are issues that the Department of Justice could and should address. They make these decisions to the exclusion of other law enforcement priorities and opportunities. So we're spending time arresting these good people and locking them up in our jails when we have real problems. And I would be very concerned, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, if I were
so that is an investigation that we need to initiate either out of Homeland and some of the responsibilities. Let me quickly ask two questions to Dr. Constance Slaughter-Harvey and then to Ms. Quirez-Lewis. I understand, Ms. Quirez-Lewis, if you, and then that many of these are Guatemalans. I don't know if many people know that a lot of Guatemalans came here. I think it was an earthquake just some months back. But in any event, a lot of issues are going on in Central America. But they have indigenous language. I want you to be able to just pierce into that, how difficult it is for their due process rights to be exercised when no one can communicate. And they may perfectly have a legitimate reason and right to either seek asylum after the fact or some other remedy. To you, Doctor, if you could comment on the idea of when the laws are misused against people of color who don't have rights or the wherewithal to defend themselves. Ms. Quirez-Lewis?
Yes, and I spoke about Elle. It was very difficult for me to communicate with her, and she spoke Spanish. And so I can just imagine what it was like hearing the orders in the language that she wasn't familiar with. Also, when she was arrested, she couldn't understand what was going on. Signing papers, which she couldn't read, and of a completely different language. We say that people understand in the language of their heart. That's the language that they learn at home. So everything is confusing. And then they get yelled at in a different language because people assume that they speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. There's 4 different indigenous languages. Right. Calling people to interpret in the court, we have to find court interpreters from all over the country because there is such limited resources. So this has been excruciating even for the folks that are doing organizing work, to doing the legal intakes, to make sure that everything that they're receiving, they're understanding accurately. Because one word can really cause a serious mistake in the due process and in the legal, and then also to obtain resources for them.
Doctor?
Madam Congressman, it is a nightmare and has been for many years to provide quality legal services to individuals who cannot communicate. We cannot communicate in Hmong. Some of us can't communicate in Spanish. And to advise an individual their constitutional rights or basic rights that we would extend to anyone in our language when they cannot understand is a travesty. And we found that in this particular instance, many of the detainees, most of whom were Guatemalans, had no earthly idea as to what was being said. None whatsoever. None of the agents, as I understand it, could speak Spanish, and definitely not Hmong. The individuals who were speaking Hmong when they were brought before our federal judge, she was kind enough to have an interpreter from California on the line. The other individuals who speak Spanish were in the dark. It was only the individual who could speak Hmong that could help these individuals. So it's really, as I said, it's an indictment on our system.
Thank the chairman. I thank the the witnesses. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will, and I'll say this again at the end, we'll probably have some questions based on some of the answers that we've had from the witnesses today, and we'll get back to you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Houston, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for appearing today. And I want to compliment all of the many people who have taken the time to be here. Mr. Chairman, as you know, we have these field hearings across the country, and your constituents have demonstrated that this is of interest to them, and that means a lot to me personally, and I think to the committee as a whole. Let us not make the mistake of assuming that what ICE imposes is not the will of the president.
All right.
I think we have to acknowledge that when the president says this is a deterrent, that this is something that is coming from the White House, and it is difficult to imagine how a president can see children separated from their parents, babies, and still say that this is a deterrent. It is difficult to imagine. It's a very painful thing to have to grapple with these issues. But let's do so. Attorney Johnson, you indicated that these people were not a threat. Let's, for the record now, place evidence in the record of what you say. Is it true that there were no gangs of Latinos that were threatening and terrorizing the people in this area? Is this the case? No gangs, Attorney Johnson?
That is true, Congressman Green. 100% true.
Father, are you aware of circumstances in the area? Would you agree that there were no gangs?
No, at all.
Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Any gangs that you've heard of terrorizing people, Latinos?
No, sir. I work as a youth court prosecutor in Scott County, and it has never come to my attention, not to my desk, that there were any gangs, Latino or Hispanics, in Scott County.
Ms. Quiros?
No,
Lewis?
sir. I work directly with the families and the youth organizing, and none of that is present.
Now, there are those who would say that the persons arrested were a drain on the economy, that they're the reason that your unemployment rate may not be at some place comparable to the national average. Were they a drain on the economy, Attorney Johnson?
To the contrary, Congressman Green, they're a vital part of an industry that creates $3 billion in revenue each year in Mississippi alone. And in addition, you do not hear Mississippians clamoring for the jobs that these people held and have held for quite some time.
Father,
I'm sorry, I didn't follow you.
are they a drain on the economy? Did they take up services that others would have benefited from, but for them being here?
Of course, I believe that the local economy and national economy is they are giving a lot to the local economy and the national economy. They are hard workers.
Thank you. And Judge?
Quite the contrary. Hispanics and Latinos in Scott County work hard. They have many skills, but they are not appreciated when it comes to compensation. The chicken plants, where most of them are employed, have suffered because no one will take the jobs that they took. So no, sir, they are not a drain. In fact, they're just the opposite.
Ms. Quiroz Lewis?
No, sir. One of the things that I witnessed when we accompanied our victims to their bail bond hearing, one of the first things they asked the judge is, can I work? Can I go back to work? Even until I'm asked to leave this country, I just want to work.
National studies have shown that those persons who are part of the immigrant community have lower crime rates than the general population. And some of it has to do with the fact that they want to stay out of the view of the constabulary. Have you found that the crime rate in the community has been higher just based on your anecdotal evidence, Attorney Johnson?
I think the crime rate in this community is exceedingly low. You'll hear from Sheriff Lee, who will confirm that. And one of the troubling things, as you know, Congressman Green, is they are so concerned about being caught up in the system that they underreport when they themselves are victims of crimes.
Let me just move quickly. If you agree with Mr. Johnson, Attorney Johnson, would you kindly just extend a hand into the air so that I can build a record? Or let the record reflect that all of the persons on the panel have agreed that the crime rate is low. Let me close with this. I appreciate what you do as persons associated with NGOs, various community organizations. This is not going to be easy, but what you're doing today will make it better for us to do something to make a change. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Memphis, Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, I'd like to commend your representative here. Representative Thompson's most respected in Washington. He's chairman of an important committee, and he's holding this hearing is important. I appreciate him inviting me here. I also want to reference, it's not necessarily derision when he said that he thinks of Memphis as being part of Mississippi. Mississippi has given us many of our greatest cultural artists who have left Mississippi. Elvis and B.B. King and a lot of others have left Mississippi for Memphis. Mississippi has given Memphis many of its finest citizens, and we've given DeSoto County some of our worst. Memphis is known as song. It's the Memphis in the Meanwhile, John Hyatt, or Long Distance Information, Get Me Memphis, Tennessee. Mississippi, I can only think of Nina Simone. But Nina Simone was thinking of an old Mississippi that Judge Slaughter Harvey remembers. Judge Slaughter Harvey, is that connection with the old Mississippi that Nina Simone sang of similar to what we have with immigrants, that there are efforts in this state that are antagonistic toward others, toward people of color?
I would say that, if not the same, maybe a little worse. It's really disheartening to look at some of the officials who are responsible for guaranteeing basic rights and notice how they look at the immigrants, how they treat them, and how they speak to them. I can identify with the disrespect and the inhumanity because I was treated in a similar way, but not nearly as bad. I knew my rights as an American citizen. These individuals don't know their rights. I could demand my rights. I could fight. They can't. So I could protect myself. They can't.
Let me remind everyone of the fact that on June, well, it wasn't June, it was April 5 of 2018, there was a raid in Bean Station, Tennessee, which at the time was the largest workplace raid in our nation in nearly a decade. And it was so similar to this one, it's eerie. I have my notes from a hearing we had concerning that. We wrote Secretary Nielsen probably to deaf ears and Commissioner Cotter. And it was similar with the way the children were treated, they were traumatized, and the actions. and the fact that the employer was not arrested. This was a meat processing plant, but the employer was not arrested, but the employees were. It makes me think that what this was, what did Tennessee, Mr. Johnson, you said, why Mississippi? I suspect why Mississippi and why Tennessee is because this is red meat that Trump is throwing to his base to say, look, I'm for you. And that's why. Mr. Johnson, do you think that might have been why it happened here?
I certainly believe that might have been why it happened here, because there is no other good explanation, Congressman Cohen. There has not been any sense in Mississippi that we are at risk in any way, that our communities are endangered in any way. So what else might it be but the dictates of an administration that hasn't learned the lessons of history, that when we round up people based on the color of their skin or their country of origin, we always look back in horror and shame.
You mentioned the previous U.S. attorney. Was that an Obama appointee?
It was an acting U.S. attorney who had begun at the end of the Bush administration and then was carried over into the beginning of the Obama administration.
Bush is starting to look pretty good.
I've said that more than once to my surprise.
You know, I'm sorry what occurred here, and it's similar to what happened in Tennessee, and I think it's a demeaning of America. And the economy here, and Father Medina, you might know, or Miss Lewis, I don't know, but in Morristown, Tennessee, which is far to the east, this hurt the economy of Morristown. Has this hurt the economy here in Mississippi as well?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
It has.
Yes, sir.
And the policy of this administration is to use these raids theoretically to deter immigration along our southern border. Does this, do you believe, in any way at all diminish the people in Central America who want a better place to come to not come here, Mr. Johnson?
They're driven by the human spirit, and I don't think anything's going to stop the effort to better your situation and help your children.
So you don't think they read the Jackson Clarion Ledger down there in Guatemala?
Or paid any attention to it.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Let me thank our panel of witnesses. You've been excellent. I will allow a member who might have another question if they want, but let me make a couple of comments. You know, a lot of the people who ICE detained never got a paycheck, never got that check. And we've been struggling trying to make sure that wherever those individuals are, the month they should have received a paycheck. So we've been working the various agencies to try to make sure that that happens. One of the things we hear around the country is that companies take the lost wages and keep them. And so the families never receive the checks. So we are trying to work with local officials to make sure that those families in fact receive whatever earnings that they would do. And that's a challenge. The other thing is, because we are a nation of laws, we can treat people better than what these raids signify. And I think this hearing is trying to elevate that. I have, for the record, it cost, this is the late, it cost $478,000 to conduct that one-day raid. That's a significant amount of money. We're still trying to get some of the other costs, but those are dead salary costs that it costs for that raid. That's a lot of money. And we think that while the people were doing their job, that discretion, because I've seen businesses that are no longer open because their customers are no longer around. And that's part of that economic concern that Congressman Green talked about and others. So I think if the individuals impacted have not been a threat to the community, then the community should have been engaged in whatever you did. So we'll hear in our next panel of witnesses what actually took place. I look forward to it. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just ask Mr. Johnson, does he have a record of how many children are still separated from their parents? If either Ms. Perez-Lewis or Mr. Johnson, do you have any knowledge?
We've attempted to come up with a number, Congresswoman. We think the number of children affected overall exceeds 1,500 children. Many children may have one parent present, but another parent is still incarcerated, detained, as Ms. Quiros recognized.
There's an outstanding letter to ICE asking for that.
So we'll get to ask that again. Do you have any
Yeah,
numbers?
No numbers, but we have several families that we're working with, and it just complicates things so much because they're American citizens, these children, and then trying to reunite them if they get deported causes a myriad of problems. So there's a lot of suffering still.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me thank the panel. Mr. Johnson, you want a closing statement?
If I may add one thing, I think we'd be remiss, all of us would be, if we didn't recognize that we're part of a larger coalition, the Mississippi Immigration Coalition. It's dangerous to attempt to list everyone, but I think, Your Honor, Congressman Thompson, it's important for everyone to recognize the hard work of organizations like MIRA, Bill Chandler and Patricia Ice, who've worked in this field for a very long time, El Pueblo, Mississippi, the Mississippi Center for Justice, the Southern Poverty Law Center, ACLU, CERN, Forward.us, the clinics at Ole Miss Law School, Bob Hildreth, who gave generously to our bond fund. We spent over $400,000 of privately raised money to try to bond out, at this point, about 60 people. Catholic Charities of the Jackson Diocese, the faith communities from these communities, and countless volunteers who have gotten nothing back from this and who are so compelled to work. And this has been a huge effort, and we're not equipped to handle this. We're doing the best we can, but it's been a team effort, and I wanted to mention those organizations.
Thank you very much. Let me thank our panel of witnesses again. Your testimony will be included in the record. The record will be kept open for 10 days, so you might have some questions, and we ask that you get back to us with your answers. Thank you very much. We're now going to ask our second panel of witnesses to please come forward.
Well done.
Yeah, they were.
Thanks to people. Like we got a lot more room. Hey. Yeah, put it right there. Thanks, Mayor. We need to scoot down. We can scoot down. You can? Okay. That's right. Don't get too squeezed up there now. Where's No. He's from the school. He's the superintendent of the school. Yeah.
Now,
You can't.
now,
Okay.
oh,
All right. Okay.
hey, Doc.
All right,
Doc.
thanks.
Doc. Stay a minute. Stay a minute. No, stay a minute. Stay a minute. Stay a minute. All right. Who is that?
He's the superintendent.
All right. We good.
They're gonna have a lot of questions to ask.
He's the superintendent of the school.
Hannah, H-A-N-N-A-H.
We're going to start our second panel of witnesses. I welcome the second panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. Jerry Miles, is the special agent in charge of the New Orleans field office for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement of the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Miles has worked with ICE Homeland Security investigations for over 10 years and has an impressive record. Welcome. Next, we have the Honorable Michael Lee, who currently serves as the sheriff for Scott County, Mississippi. The sheriff's law enforcement duties include keeping the peace within the county in addition to serving as the county's jailer and keeping a jail docket. He currently lives in Forest, Mississippi. Welcome. Last, Dr. William Truly serves as the mayor of Canton, Mississippi. Canton was one of the 6 cities where the site of an ICE raid on August 7th. He was elected to office in 2017, but began working in the public interest at the age of 16. And he's accompanied at the table with the superintendent of Canton Public Schools, one of the districts located. Without objections, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for about 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Miles.
Chairman Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to
Hit your mic.
Sorry about that, sir. Chairman Thompson and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss HSI's worksite enforcement strategy, which consists of a 3-pronged approach: enforcement, criminal arrest of employers and administrative arrest of employees, compliance, Form I-9 employment eligibility verification inspections, civil fines and suspension and debarment, and outreach, the ICE Mutual Agreement Between Government and Employers program. Homeland Security Investigations is the department's primary criminal investigative agency and is focused on disrupting and dismantling transnational criminal organizations. As the sole investigative agency with combined customs and immigration authorities, HSI investigates and enforces more than 400 federal criminal statutes that protects our nation's trade, travel, financial, and immigration systems. HSI special agents use this authority to investigate all types of cross-border criminal activity and work in close coordination with our federal, state, local, tribal, and international partners in a unified enforcement strategy to secure the United States. Today, I would like to speak about our successful efforts in conducting targeted law enforcement operations. We do not conduct raids, sweeps, or checkpoints. Any such reports create panic and place communities and law enforcement personnel in unnecessary danger. Groups falsely reporting such activities are doing a disservice to those they claim to support. HSI utilizes Form I-9 inspections across a wide spectrum of industries throughout the United States. HSI refers for suspension and debarment from federal government contracting individuals and businesses that commit serious criminal or civil offenses or engage in fraud or other seriously improper conduct. The ICE Mutual Agreement Between Government and Employers program is a voluntary partnership with the private sector that offers training to strengthen the integrity of employers' workforces and curb employment of unauthorized workers. The IMAGE program seeks to promote principles of ethical business conduct and prevent the deliberate hiring of unauthorized workers through employer self-governance. As ethical and diligent employers begin to adopt the IMAGE best practices, HSI will be able to more efficiently enhance its focus on unscrupulous employers and egregious violators of the nation's immigration laws. HSI prioritizes its criminal worksite enforcement investigations by focus on the most egregious violators, which include employers that mistreat or exploit their workers based upon their unlawful status, aid in the smuggling of their alien workforce into the United States, create false identity documents or facilitate document fraud, utilize unauthorized workers as a business model, and or knowingly and willfully hire unauthorized workers. HSI continues to prioritize the protection of our nation's critical infrastructures and key resource sectors and industries by ensuring that unauthorized workers do not have access to sensitive facilities or information. On August 7, 2019, HSI executed 8 federal criminal search warrants and 7 federal civil search warrants. These warrants were the result of an approximately 18-month investigation that was initiated pursuant to tip line leads against the companies involved. and today I will attempt to explain it in the time allotted to me. HSI worked diligently to develop a comprehensive plan to address the concerns that came out of previous activities of this size or nature. HSI conducted coordination meetings, first on a biweekly and later a weekly basis among all of our participating partners, as well as ICE enforcement and removal operations leading up to the execution of the operation. Each search location was given its own supervisory group to manage detention decisions at a local level to minimize the detention period of those determined to be amenable to some type of humanitarian release. There were 32 such cases to include 9 minors that self-identified on scene. HSI pre-assigned personnel to make phone calls to the impacted schools after the operations began. We also set up a friends and family telephone hotline, which provided custody information to relatives and friends of individuals who were detained in connection with this enforcement operation. This hotline provided information to 343 callers. HSI has dedicated more than 24,000 investigative hours to this case, seized more than 850,000 documents, 61 digital devices, and more than 22 terabytes of data. To date, there are 119 indictments for criminal activities and the identification of more than 400 individuals using previously issued Social Security numbers. That's ID theft. These investigations continue. I am grateful for the opportunity to appear before you and share HSI's efforts to conduct targeted workplace enforcement actions and discuss our continued commitment to utilize our full complement of authorities. I thank you for the support you provide to HSI as we execute our mission, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Sheriff Lee to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, it is an honor and a privilege to be invited to appear before you to discuss the recent immigration enforcement actions in Scott County. I'm Mike Lee. I'm Sheriff of Scott County, have been since 2007. I previously served as Chief of Police for the City of Forest for 10 years and have nearly 30 years of law enforcement career enforcement. I have lived in Scott County all my life. As the highest ranked law enforcement officer in Scott County, I am responsible for policing our entire county. For perspective of our county, Scott County is east of our capital city, Jackson. The county has approximately 28,000 residents. The most recent census data provided by the U.S. Census Bureau states that approximately 11.5% of our citizens identify as Latino. We have had Latino workers in Scott County since the 1990s. Cook Foods employs over 3,000 people, some of which are immigrants. Latinos constitute a large workforce in Scott County and are important to our economy. Those workers have become a part of our community. Their children attend local schools and participate in local sports. The feedback I have received from our citizens is that folks admire Latino communities, our Latino communities' work ethic and their commitment to family. In my role as sheriff, I do not believe Latino workers present a danger to our community. I base that on the fact that I have not seen a spike in crime as a result of Latino individuals living and working in our county. Currently, my jail, the Scott County Detention Center, is holding approximately 125 inmates. Only 3 of those 125 inmates identify as Latino, and 1 of those 3 is actually a Scott County resident. This, in my opinion, is the best evidence of the lack of impact Latino workers have had on Scott County's criminal justice system. Simply put, the Scott County Sheriff's Department has not had problems with the Latino community. I previously mentioned Cook Foods. Cook is one of Scott County's largest employers. On August 7th, 2019, of course, Cook Foods was one of the plants in the state of Mississippi federal immigration officials raided. Nearly 250 employees were arrested at Cook Foods by immigration officers. First, let me say that as sheriff, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Mississippi. I stand behind our federal officers, and in no way am I criticizing the hard work of enforcing our immigration laws. However, I feel that the actions on this day could have been handled better had my agency been prepared in advance. My office had no notice of the raid and therefore was taken by surprise. After the raids, my office the school system, local citizens, all had to step up to care for many of the children whose parents were arrested. Children of those arrested had nowhere to go for hours once school let out. The first parents to return to Scott County did not arrive until 11 p.m. that night. Thanks to our schools, local citizens, that included my wife and daughter, and my department, we were able to care for those children during the interim. However, forewarning of the action, or while the action was foregoing, would have allowed my office to be better prepared for the problems left in the wake of the raid. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Dr. Truly for his statement for 5 minutes.
My name is William Truly, practicing physician and mayor of the city of Canton. I certainly want to recognize Congressman Lee and thank you for all of the good deeds that you have done, not just for the state of Mississippi, for this nation. Congressman Thompson, we're well aware of your contributions to this nation, and Congressman Green and Congressman Cohen, we thank you for being here, here in our state. I have with me today, who is not testifying, but who is with me, the Superintendent of Schools of the Canton Circuit School District, Mr. Gary Hanna. I also have with me my Chief of Police, Mr. Otha Brown, and I also have with me my Fire Chief, Mr. Kenneth Pierce. What happened on the day of the raid was supposed to have been a surreptitious clandestine act perpetrated by ICE. I want to take you back to August the 7th, 2019, when, without warning, notice, or acknowledgement, ICE invaded the city of Canton and raided Pico Poultry for the purpose of identifying and documenting undocumented immigrants who worked at Pico Foods. There were 7 poultry industries in the state of Mississippi that were raided by ICE for the purpose of accomplishing an intended mission. As the mayor of the city of Canton, I was never noticed or informed about the pre-plans and imminent raid of one of our businesses here in the city of Canton. My discovery was accidental as a consequence of a citizen informing me that ICE was on Fulton Street at Pico's carrying workers away by handcuffs and who were transported to the National Guard Armory in Flowood, Mississippi. I approached one of the ICE officers and introduced myself as the mayor of the city of Canton and requested to speak with whomever was in charge for the purpose of trying to understand and assess what was occurring in my city. It was at that time I was able to visualize only Hispanic workers being placed on buses for the purpose of being transported to a site which was unknown to me at that time. To my knowledge, no African American workers were arrested or transported. My Chief of Police, Otha Brown, the Superintendent of Education, Gary Hanna, and the Director of the Department of Human Services were never informed. It is my understanding that at the time that the raid took place, that some of the individuals were documented with appropriate papers. This was the first day of school, and the children of these individuals who were arrested and transported to an unknown site to be processed, the children were still in school. And the children returned home not knowing that their parents had been arrested. The Hispanic population in the city of Canton are not gang members. They are not rapists. They're not murderers, but folks who work and pay taxes, purchase goods, take care of each other and their families. It is my understanding that at Pico's Foods, there were at least 125 to 130 Hispanic employees who were arrested that resulted in an acute loss of 125 to 130 PICO workers. I do not know the economic loss to PICOs, nor do I know the economic loss or impact of this raid to the city of Canton, but I do know that it was an economic impact. Throughout the state of Mississippi, there were 7 poultry industries that were raided, 680 people arrested, 30 of those were released. This was a terrifying moment for those individuals who were arrested. That included the separation of parents from children. It is my understanding that nothing was in place for the children of the arrestees to be safe, protected, and secured. No social services, including DHS, were placed on notice to target children who were going to be separated from their parents. I am of the opinion that when ICE raids or invades a community, or a target in that community, at least the mayor and the governing authorities, the chief of police, the superintendent of schools, and the director of human services should be placed on notice. It was a terrifying experience for the arrestees and a puzzling experience for me and for my community. Congressman Coyne talked about Nina Simone. A lot of people in here are too young to remember Nina Simone, but when she was talking about that record, Mississippi Goddamn, she was talking about Plessy versus Ferguson as we went over to the Board of Education, Brown versus the Board of Education. She was talking about the Little Rock Nine. She was talking about marriage being blocked out of the University of Mississippi. She was talking about Sharonda Goodman and Cheney. She was talking about the atrocities of humanity and man's inhumanity to man. She was talking about brutality and apartheid during the days of yesteryear. You asked the question, have things changed? I hope so. Thank all of you.
Thank you very much. I yield myself 5 minutes for questioning. Sheriff Lee, your testimony was as a chief law enforcement official in Scott County, you received no advance notice of the ICE raids we're talking about here.
No, sir. I received no advance notice, nor did I receive any notice while the raids were continuing.
Thank you. Mayor, your testimony as the mayor of Canton, that your conversation with the superintendent of education and your chief of police and fire chief, that there was no notification.
That's correct, sir.
So, Mr. Miles, what does the policy for ICE say about notification?
To be honest with you, Mr. Chairman, we don't have a policy that says we're obligated to notify anyone.
So I want to enter into a record, a letter from Matthew Abens, who's Deputy Director, Senior Official performing duties as Director for ICE. And let me tell you what he said in his letter September 7th. He said the school districts contacted during this operation include Covington, Jasper, Jones, Wayne, Lauderdale, Smith, Newton, Scott, Madison, Rankin, Clark, Quitman, Leake, Laurel, and Forest counties. So somebody is wrong. And I'll enter this into the record.
But is there a question, Mr. Chairman? Because I have a list of all the names we contacted at those school districts.
Well, if you have them, you need to provide them to the committee.
Then I'm more than happy to provide
So
them to the committee.
did you contact the Scott County Sheriff's Department?
Never said I did, sir. But I did
Wait,
say.
wait,
But we did say we contacted the school districts.
Now, I'll ask the question. You just
Okay.
answered. All right? So did you contact the Scott County Sheriff's Department?
No, sir, we did not.
Thank you.
But we did contact the school districts.
Did you contact the Madison County School District?
Yes, sir. Assistant Superintendent Ellen R. Good.
What about the Canton School District?
Canton doesn't seem to be on here. It seems like we only contacted county school districts.
So if I told you that Pico Foods was located in the Canton School District,
Then I would say it was an oversight.
it was an oversight.
That's correct.
Okay, but you did not contact them.
On the list that I have, there's no reflection of a Canton school
Well-
district being contacted.
So what social service agencies did you contact?
We didn't contact any social service agencies, but it was my understanding that the United States Attorney's Office spoke to someone in the social service agency, but I don't remember their name.
Who told you that?
The United States Attorney.
Who? The United States
Yes,
Attorney?
sir. The United States Attorney. He was in our office in Jackson, Mississippi during the day of the raid, the same as me, all day
So
long.
he told you he talked to somebody, but you don't know who.
I don't remember the name. I don't remember the name that he gave me.
So have you gotten any information about the companies who had the individuals employed?
I'm sorry, what do you mean?
Well, in terms, you performed the work site raids.
No, sir, I did. We did 8 criminal search warrants.
Okay,
And-
you were there.
And you asked me if I got any information about the companies. In my testimony, I entered that we seized 850,000 documents, and we seized 22 terabytes of information. That is not needed to prove that people are here illegally, sir.
So what is needed?
Pardon me?
What is needed if you say that is not needed?
That is our investigation against the other allegations in the investigation.
What other allegation?
The one that you keep alluding to, sir, whether we're investigating a company or not.
Well, I'm just trying to get to the information.
And
Now, I'll ask the questions, and I hope you be civil with your response.
I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah, you're not doing too good. So
So are you insinuating I'm lying?
well,
Because
I'm saying you're not responding. I didn't say you were a lie.
No,
And so
you
look,
asked me
look,
what you asked
no,
me what
look.
we got there, sir, and I told you what we got there. I got 850,000 documents.
Now, look, I'll ask the questions.
Okay.
And you just answer only when you ask the question.
Okay.
No editorializing.
Okay.
Thank you. Sheriff, you've been in Scott County all your life. One of the things we're trying to do with this hearing is determine whether or not the people who were arrested were threats to the community, had they created any problem. And I think your testimony has pretty much said these are good people. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. The workers that, pretty much, let me make sure I'm making this clear, but the workers that were taken, primarily, if not all, they may have criminal records unknown to me, but were good, hardworking people.
Thank you. I yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. And let me thank all the witnesses. Let me thank Mr. Miles, Sheriff Lee. Greetings from my sheriff in Houston. I work extensively with law enforcement and mayor, of course. Let me give greetings from my mayor in Houston, Mayor Sylvester Turner. I know that you all have probably interacted. And thank you for your leadership along with the superintendent. Let me be very clear. This hearing is not, Mr. Miles, intended to not recognize the legal apparatus of the United States of America dealing with the question of law and immigrants. We're a nation of laws, and we're a nation of immigrants. But I do want to pointedly try to raise some concerns, and I want you to take it in the spirit that I have responsibility of oversight, as the chairman has brought us here for this hearing. So let me find out, did you find any high dollar target amongst the 608 persons that you wrapped up and raided?
I would ask you to clarify what do you mean by a high dollar target?
Some persons that were involved in major criminal activity, somebody that you had been looking for decades, years, months. You find anybody in that group?
To date, no, ma'am.
All
We've
right.
not found anybody in that group.
You released, my time is short, you released about 303 individuals immediately. So that shows that they either had some basis of being able to get out. Is that correct?
We released them for humanitarian reasons, yes,
Well,
ma'am.
but that means that they were not where you said even with humanitarian reasons they're too dangerous to release. That was the case. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And how long have you been in ICE? How long have you been an ICE officer?
I've been an ICE officer since its inception in 2003.
So under the Obama administration for 8 years, you were able to do your job. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you do a raid of this type? And I know that under the previous administration there were deportations. I'm not asking that question. A raid of this type during those 8 years, just you in particular.
No, ma'am. Those 8 years I was in Mexico.
All right, but you did not engage in one.
No, not in Mexico.
Whether you were in Mexico or the United States. And so this raid came under, as has been indicated, this administration didn't get any high dollar target, used $500,000 in 1 day's work almost, as I understand the numbers. Is that correct?
It was my understanding that the numbers that we provided were for the cost for the total investigation. I would have to go back and look at that.
But you have to go back. Now, do you have the precise numbers of children that are still not reunited with their family?
No, ma'am, I don't have that number.
Do you realize how indicting that answer is? Do you realize that we who are in this room are parents? I would imagine you might be. I don't want to project. But you may have relatives, nieces and nephews. But we're looking at families here. For me to sit here as a mother and have the answer that you do not know the answer to, or the question, how many are not yet reunited? Let me make an official request. I think the chairman has already had a letter. Again, I want to know the numbers of children that are not yet reunited with their family members. Will you provide that to us, sir?
I will do everything in my power to get you the number you requested.
Let me, because of the circumstances, let me, thank you, sir, very much. I promote the working of federal law enforcement with local law enforcement, Sheriff. How devastating is it for your department out on the streets dealing with protecting this community not to know about this raid? How devastating, how piercing it is in terms of relationship with your federal law enforcement, which I know you work with very well.
Yes, we work with all federal agencies and welcome all federal agencies in and work well with them to, I assume that when these raids were done, the need for secrecy was felt to keep them from local law enforcement so that, for lack of better terms, word did not get out. And I understand that, but if our office could have been notified after these raids or during these raids, we somewhat could have been able to easily handle the situation we had after the schools let out. I wish I had a monetary amount to know how much Scott County citizens spent with the Sheriff's Department, to know how much money we lost trying to make sure that children were in right places and trying to play catch-up.
Thank you. Doctor, would you, as mayor, we believe in local officials being apprised and respected in our federal efforts. What did that do to you and your community and the responsibilities you have as mayor? Everybody calls the mayor.
Well, we have a responsibility to keep people safe. When you have ICE coming in and raiding your community, there's always the potentiality for escalation. Escalation that perhaps the outcome may not be good. I'm under the impression that our health department, our ambulance, our police chief, our fire chief, and all of those who have an interest in protecting folks need to know that a situation like this has occurred in your town, and there's always the risk for a negative outcome. There's always traffic jams. There are always problems. So I think that we just need to know. I think that a policy or some kind of guidelines need to be instituted by Congress of letting at least the chief of police know.
Do you think the policies, Mayor, were cruel?
Ma'am?
Do you think the policies were cruel in terms of how mothers
Well, I
and
think
children?
so. No, I mean, it is almost like an agency came in and took over our town.
I'm sorry.
It is like an agency came in and took over our town, and we didn't know anything about the agency coming in. It just simply came into town without any collaboration, without any corroboration or acknowledgement.
I thank you, Mayor. Just Mr. Miles, did you arrest any companies so far right here in this community? Have you charged any of the employers? Have you charged any of the employers?
No, ma'am. To date, we have not charged any of the
You
employees.
have not charged any of the employers.
No, ma'am.
That warrants me taking off my glasses, Mr. Chairman. I just want to put this in the record. I'm concluding. Thank you, sir. The Federal Register, if I could put into the record, Federal Register of July 1st, 2019, Mr. Chairman, volume 84, number 126, it will evidence that a facility for unaccompanied children in Carrizo, Texas is empty, but they have been allotted $300,800,000 to retain unaccompanied children, and they've been allotted $50 million for the first crunch, and that facility is now empty. And so I just want to contribute that for the concept of the failed policies that we're now having a hearing for. But that I yield back. Ask
Thank you.
unanimous consent to put in the record.
Without objection. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miles, would you, for the record, just state your official title, please?
Yes, sir. I am the Special Agent in charge for Homeland Security Investigations out of New Orleans, Louisiana.
And how long have you held this post, please?
Since 2018, March 4th was my official date of report.
And as it relates to this raid, how long did you participate in the planning of it?
How long did I participate in the planning
Yes,
of
sir.
it? I probably got involved with the planning of it in June of 2019.
So you were there for an extensive amount of time?
There's no good way to answer that question, sir. The best I can say is we had meetings on a regular basis because, again, my office is in New Orleans. So most of the planning occurred in Jackson. I would travel over for the meetings as
And
appropriate.
did your plan work pretty much as you intended?
I would say that our plan worked well. To sit here and say that it was a perfect plan would not be.
Not perfect, but it worked well.
Yes.
So you planned to have 10 phones for 680 detained people.
11, yes, sir.
11 phones.
Yes, sir.
Understanding that people would have to contact relatives, have children picked up, but you decided on 11 phones for 680 people.
That is correct, sir.
And you planned to separate the children from their parents.
No, sir. We plan to arrest people that were violating federal law.
And in the process, did you contemplate, I'm sure you did, that some of these persons would have children?
Yes, sir, we did.
So you had to plan to separate them, or you were going to plan to keep them together, but the evidence is such that you separated them. Is this true? Doesn't the evidence show that you separated children from their parents? It does.
I would argue that if you're going to use the definition of the word separate, no, we did not, because the word separate insinuates that the children were with them. The children were not with them.
Well,
The
let me
children were
ask
in
you
school.
this. Were they able to go home to their children that evening? Were a good many people?
No, sir. Like anybody that gets arrested for a
Well,
crime in the United States, they don't
The
go
government
home.
has many definitions, but when a parent can't go back to a child, and the child is expecting the parent, in my world, that parent is separated from the child.
As is with anybody that's arrested in the United States, sir.
Thank you.
Any person in your district.
And is it true that you separated mothers who were breastfeeding?
My understanding is that we received reports of that, and none of those reports ever bore out.
Well, I've got evidence from my reports indicating that at least 3 mothers who were breastfeeding were separated from their babies.
And we will take that evidence as well, sir, because
There's
every
also a
report that I
witness in this
received, we
room.
responded to.
There's a person in this room who spoke to me this morning and indicated that she's aware of a mother who was separated, who was breastfeeding.
And my argument to that would be then bring the mother, because that's the only way we work with testimony. We don't work with secondhand testimony.
So now, let's see if we can summarize. You planned this raid. As a result of the raid, parents were separated from their children. As a result of the raid, mothers who may or may not have been breastfeeding were separated from their children. As a result of the raid, you had 11 phones for some 600 persons who were going to need to contact people. And as a result of the raid, you on the first day of school, separated parents from their children, in the sense that those parents were not there to pick up their children on the first day of school. Did you plan to do this on the first day of school?
We plan to do it on August 7th.
Was it unknown to you that August the 7th was the first day of school?
I would say that, yes, it was unknown to me that it was the first day of school.
Well, then is it the case then that you did not plan well?
Again, I think we planned well for the fact that it was a day of school.
You said you planned well. Are you concluding that you planned well by, on the first day of school, implementing this raid in this area? So you planned well. If you planned well, you did what you said you were going to do.
My thing would be, what is the difference between the first day or the 10th day of school? The parents are still not going home. We planned for that.
Well, here's the difference. I'm proud to tell you, but I wish the superintendent could tell you, but I'm going to tell you what it is. Those children, many of them, are going to school for the first time. It's the first day for a lot of first graders. These babies are expecting their parents to be there for them when they return home. Babies ought not be separated from their parents, Mr. Miles. Babies ought not be separated. And Mr. Miles, my time is up, but I've got to say this to you. I don't believe that you believe that this was a very good deterrent. I don't believe it, but I want you to say it. Do you believe that this was a very good deterrent?
Deterrent to what?
Deterrent in the sense that the chief executive officer of this current said it was a good deterrent. That your boss, the president.
Okay. So am I allowed to editorialize now?
You're allowed to tell me whether or not you think this was a good deterrent.
I absolutely believe it was a good deterrent.
That is unfortunate, because taking babies from mothers is not the deterrent that this country was to be known for. We are a better country than this, to borrow a phrase from my colleague, Mr. Cummings. We are a better country, Mr. Miles. We're a better country. I yield back, Mr. President.
Gentleman from Texas, yield back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First to Mayor Truly.
Yes, sir.
You and Congressman Thompson and the sheriff here and Mr. Johnson and Judge are indications that Mississippi is better, and I know Mississippi's better. It couldn't have been worse, but it's much better. But when I see the shootings at the Emmett Till sign and when I see the Klan being observed there, I worry about some of the elements that still exist in Mississippi, and I'm sure you do as well. Mr. Miles, does your jurisdiction include Bean Station, Tennessee?
It does not now, sir.
Did it when the raid occurred there?
It absolutely did.
Was the employer there charged with any offenses?
It's my understanding that one of the employers there has pled guilty and has been sentenced to 18 months.
One.
That is correct, but he was the CEO.
All right. The raid was because of IRS irregularities. None of the people who were arrested other than him had IRS problems, did they?
To be honest, sir, I don't know what happened before my tenure here.
I'm talking about in Bean Station.
No, I know when you're talking about, sir. It was before my tenure here.
Okay.
I didn't take over. My own paper, I reported March 4th, but I didn't actually show up until late April. This occurred before I showed up.
I got you.
So I wasn't in the planning or any of it.
Let me ask you this, and this is a question that you hopefully have some information from. we have heard, or it's been reported to me, that immigration organizations that come to Tallahatchie to help detainees, that people detained from raids are kept separate from the asylum population. Do you know if that's true or not?
I don't know, sir. That would be a question for enforcement and removal operation as they manage all of our detention population.
Okay. So you're not familiar. This would be how many of the people seeking asylum are seeking immigration judges while detained at Tallahatchie, again, beyond your knowledge?
That is correct, sir.
And let me go back to what Mr. Green was asking you. First, on the school day and not knowing it was the first day of school, I can kind of understand you might have other things in mind, but in the future you might want to take that into consideration. And the raid could have been a week earlier when school was not in session, and have been just as effective as not, and yet the parents would have been home. So maybe in the future you take that into consideration. Do you know how many of the people that were arrested here in Mississippi had previous violent criminal histories?
I do have a number for previous criminal histories.
How about violent criminal history?
I'm looking right now.
Thank you, sir.
I think we have 6 domestic violence, 1 rape, 2 battery, 1 resisting arrest, and
Resisting arrest is not a felony.
I wouldn't know, sir. It's a state crime. In the state I was in, resisting arrest is a felony.
So we're in Louisiana. It's a felony for battery?
No, sir. I was a deputy sheriff of South Carolina for 8 years.
Okay.
South Carolina, resisting arrest was a felony.
Resisting arrest is different than just a battery, though. I might have
Yeah,
misunderstood.
exactly. I thought you said resisting arrest
No,
wasn't
sir.
a felony. No, I'm sorry. Then battery could be a felony. It depends upon the battery.
Well, let's not get into all those technicalities. Not
Absolutely.
many of the people had violent crimes.
That is correct.
And how many of those people are still incarcerated? Do you know?
I would not have that number, sir. Again, the detention is run by our enforcement and removal operations.
Okay. Sheriff Lee, I want to commend you on your position and your state. You reflect well on Mississippi, and I'm real happy Forest is spelled with 1 R. I had to check that out.
Yes, sir.
That's good.
Yes, sir.
How has this affected your city economically?
Economically, we have, what was alluded to, I believe, by the chairman earlier, we have businesses that are there for our Latino community. These businesses act within the laws, and there are no problems with those. And some of those stores that are near where Cook Foods is in Scott County are either in the process of closing down or have completely closed down.
And Mayor, how did this affect Canton?
Well, has had a negative impact on the city of Canton when you have that many people who are arrested. Those individuals purchase goods. Many of them purchase homes. As a consequence of lack of income, that's not going to happen.
What was your medical specialty, or what is your medical specialty?
Family medicine.
As a
and
family
emergency
practice
medicine.
doc, how do you think this psychological effect on children will last with them, if it will? Was it a temporary thing, or is it a lifelong?
It's ad infinitum.
So that can't be taken away, and that's going to affect those children forever.
That's yes.
And let me follow up with Mr. Miles. When Mr. Green's question about, do you think this was an effective deterrent? You said it was. Why do you think this is a deterrent to folks wanting to come across the border and to come to the United States?
I think it's an effective deterrent because a lot of the people that are coming here for economic reasons. And when we start telling them that coming here illegally to get employment is not going to work, it will deter them from coming here. I think that what happens is we confuse the argument of asylees and economic immigration, and there's a vast difference. I spent 7 years in Mexico. Spent 7 years working with the Mexican government, the Guatemalan government, looking at immigration, looking at cartels. So I am telling you that when we take away some of the economic incentive, it is going to have an impact. I think one of the witnesses previously made a comment of, do they read the Jackson Herald? No, they don't. But the people that move them here, that is a whole other underground industry. They know, and they tell them. And then they say, come now, don't do this, because it is. Again, it is a huge industry. And the fact that we're sitting here and we're talking about it in these terms about how it's not dangerous to Mississippi, fine. There are 400 stolen IDs there of these innocent employees. You keep saying they haven't committed a crime. They're law-abiding citizens. They stole the IDs of 400 U.S. citizens. 400 U.S. citizens. Where's their voice?
Mr. Miles, you've got a tough job, and there's some poem, I guess, it's about the military, not to reason, ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do or die, and you're kind of put in that spot. You don't make the policy, you have to carry it out. I understand that. But I also think that going after employers, and you mentioned in response to Mr. Chairman Thompson that you got all this data, and I hope you use the data to get the employers, because if the employers who are really the root of the problem don't have an incentive to hire the folks, and they won't have that incentive if they are arrested like the gentleman was, or the man was, or woman, or whoever, in being stationed, and then you're not going to have that problem. And it seems like that's a place you should concentrate your activities.
Representative Cohen, that is exactly what we're doing. That's why this case was started 18 months ago, for the purpose of going after the highest level we can get to. That's what HSI does. We're not satisfied with going after the low-level people. But as I'm assuming all of you understand, it is a lengthy process to build a criminal prosecution. We serve search warrants. That's one step in the building of a criminal investigation. It's not the final step. It's not the first step. It is a step. Unfortunately, it's a very visible step, and we come under a lot of criticism for it. And then 7 months from now, a year from now, when we finalize the investigation, there will be nobody thanking us for it.
Thank you, sir, and I appreciate your service.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from Texas has a question.
I'm going to follow up on that previous line of question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to say we thank you for your service. I think I acknowledge the fact that this is a nation of laws, a nation of immigrants as well. Let me again focus on the collective results, even though this is still going somewhat through the process. I see a sign back there. I think I can read it by one of the mothers, one of the members of the community. It says, "We need the whole family." I think that's what her sign is saying. And so I believe she's talking about to keep the family together, and children should not be separated. So I cannot emphasize enough that you must give us the numbers, if you will, of the children still unaccompanied. The second is to deal with, I am baffled by the purpose of this raid, because the number of agents could have as well found these individuals in their respective homes over a period of time. Now, at the same time that you were doing this raid, the President of the United States announced another cruel act of indicating to cities across America that he was getting ready to raid across this country. And that means that mayors and police persons had to try to address the panic. And I think it was earlier said, it interferes with law enforcement because no one wants to give information as to whether they're victimized if they're in that community, or to be able to help if they see some crime being perpetrated. So you were being victimized yourself by this announcement that really petered out, unless they're going to do it on Christmas Day. Maybe that's when they're going to do it next. In Houston, Texas, our churches opened the doors. I led an effort to make sure that people were protected, not against ultimately being brought to a response, but for the fear of raids at 1 and 2 in the morning or whenever they would be. My question to you, as you were saying that there was some value to it, but my question to you, I understand the military adheres to the rules and the orders of the commander-in-chief, but ICE is a civilian organization, and in America, civilian, federal workers, and others have rights. If someone in your organization came and said, this is not the right way to do this, this is not effective, this is cruel, it's inhumane, tears are coming to my eyes, I'm a parent, how would that person be responded to? Would you send that person's information up to Washington? Would it get to the Secretary of Homeland Security? Would the President be aware that some of the very people that are working under these cruel policies feel offended and that they don't work? Would that happen?
I would say that, yes, I would relay that information to my chain of command. That's what I would do with any complaint that a worker brought forward to me. But I will say this, if I'm permitted, is that it's one thing to sit here and say, this is cruel, this is this is the other, but it is the law, and the Congress writes and enacts the law. We don't. And the problem with looking at us and saying you should exercise discretion, I honestly believe it puts too much power in the hands of the police. Do you not? Because if you want us as a unit, as a group to go, will not enforce the law, that's not really what we're designed for.
Miles,
it's designed for you to change the law.
And first of all, let me just say, this chairman has allowed you to answer any question. You have rights here, and I welcome your answer. But I beg to differ with you. It is not Congress's policy to separate families and mothers from children. That is the policy of the President of the United States. That's not our policy. That's not our policy.
Didn't say it was. I said it's a criminal law to come into this country illegally.
No,
It's
well,
a criminal law to steal the ID of
we had
400
the
U.S.
policy
citizens.
as a misdemeanor. This administration has altered it to be a felony. But let me finish my just this last question, Mr. Chairman. So we didn't create that policy. But at the same time, it was not our policy. The law is one thing, but to implement the law in certain ways is another thing. There is no prohibition for agents to go knock on doors of people who they know where they are, or to indicate to the employer, we need 10 people to come out from the job. There's nothing that stops you from doing it. It might take longer, but let me finish my line of questioning to you. That person would not be retaliated against, right? Who decided to say, enough is enough, because I know these people come from places where they're being decapitated and murdered, and so their information would go up. Is that my understanding?
If someone came and filed a complaint and said they didn't want to do this job, yes, ma'am.
And finally, it's my understanding that to date, there have been no major crimes solved except for the immediacy of immigration laws, but no major crimes have been solved out of the 608 persons that were rounded up, now 303 taken out. Is that correct?
400
Today.
cases of identity theft, ma'am.
Pardon me?
400 cases of identity theft.
And I don't diminish that. But
But is
I
that
am
not a
saying-
serious crime?
But I am saying that.
But is that not a serious crime? You're asking if there's a serious crime.
Just a minute
time.
now. She's got to ask the question before you can answer it.
But she did. She asked if it's a serious
wait,
crime,
wait.
and 400
Dan,
identity
Dan.
theft is a serious crime. No?
Mr. Miles,
Okay.
just calm down. You be all right.
I'm very calm,
Okay.
sir.
No, then be quiet.
Oh, okay, so that's different. I'll be quiet, but it's not calm down. I'm very calm.
Let me say this, Mr. Miles, because you won't get me on the record saying that identity theft is not important and serious. All of us have been in law enforcement, me from the perspective of being a former judge in a municipal court, and as well being involved with this committee and judiciary for a very long time. So what I'm saying is, you made no major, massive bust of some syndicate or crime issue. Individual cases like that are important. I'm just getting that yes or no. You did not bust any major crime syndicates. Is that correct?
No, ma'am, we did
All right.
not bust any major crime syndicates.
Right. So, Mr. Chairman, let me just say I'm not sure if this is the time that we're supposed to respond to closing, or I yield back, but I'd certainly like to make a few points.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miles, in your letter, or pardon me, your testimony, your written testimony, you indicate that ICE and HSI conducts targeted law enforcement operations. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And to conduct a targeted law enforcement operation requires that you do some advanced investigation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And it would cause one to assume that you knew that at these various locations there would be persons who would be in violation of the laws that you were enforcing. Is this correct?
That is correct, sir.
And if you knew that there were persons who were in violation of the laws, namely immigrants, you would also have some evidence that employers were in violation of the law as well.
Sir, that's a complicated question that you
Not
can't
a
answer.
complicated
Yes,
question,
it
Mr.
is, sir.
Miles. Mr. Miles, if you know that the employees are there and that you've got an E-Verify system and you're going to arrest the employees, you have evidence that the employers are also in violation of the law, Mr. Miles. You have that evidence. Now, I walked you through it. I walked you through it with intentionality, Mr. Miles, because here's what happens. You indicated that you wanted to take away the economic incentives. And you do that by coming in and taking the undocumented persons, have them do a perp walk, show some of that on television, and then you can somehow deter persons in your mind. You think you can anyway. But you don't have a perp walk for the employers. They don't get arrested. You don't handcuff them and take them away. You're still investigating them. Is it true that you have not arrested an employer? There's no employer jail for this? Is this true? You said it was earlier, Mr. Miles. You need not think long. Sophisticated sophistry is not going to be available today. Is it true that there are no employers incarcerated?
It is true. There are no employers
None.
incarcerated.
And this happened months ago.
That is true.
You knew before you came that laws were being broken, but you picked on the undocumented persons to the exclusion of the employers who were supposed to check the E-Verify system. Mr. Miles, this is not the way we treat people in the United States of America.
Gentleman yields back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for inviting me here. I've learned a lot. It's been a privilege to be in Tougaloo, this famous institution. And I have to get back to Memphis. I've got a day's worth of folks waiting in my office starting at 3 o'clock, and I got to meet with them. So I'm off to Memphis.
Yeah, well, let me thank you again for coming down. Your presence has meant a lot to us. Thank you very much. So we will have, in the interest of time, a wrap-up.
Let me, Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. Again, I must emphasize to Mississippi what a major asset Chairman Thompson has been to the securing of this nation. We do not take a back seat on this committee. Every day we walk into the Homeland Security room, meeting room, we know the daunting responsibility we have to all of the witnesses here to care for this nation. And to all of those who are here, I know that amongst you are patriots, men and women who served in the United States military. I was just recently in a hearing or in a meeting dealing with the unfortunate treatment of immigrant military personnel. And so we are being guided by policies that really have no basis in substance. They are skewing the Constitution and the way we have matched immigrants and laws and citizens. Mr. Miles, you're on record saying no employer has been arrested. That is why my question was whether or not if there was a SAC, special agent in charge, or a ICE officer, agent, who came and said, this is patently unfair. I would hope that their message would get to Washington, to us, to the Secretary, and maybe ultimately to the person who's been the implementator of these cruel and unworkable policies that are impacting families and children. The President needs to know that in the places beyond the boundaries of Washington, none of his policies are working. There is no border wall. He is cruelly separating children. Families are being if you will, not reunited. And I don't know whether or not you're making the nation safe with these particular policies, not suggesting your work does not make us safe. So I hope that you can convey that there is a great deal of disturbance around this issue. No employer arrested, children not able to give us the numbers of those still separated. The idea that we want to promote from Washington is cooperation with local officials, school districts, superintendents, and now you're saying to us, or we are seeing here, I'm embarrassed that these local officials have a responsibility. The sheriff even admitted that you could have investigations that may not need an immediate information out, but while it was going on, the mistreatment of the mayor when he asked an agent what is going on, and an agent cutting a seatbelt. Anybody with a weak heart might have passed out right there, and it was a woman. So I want to close my remarks by an apology to these families. I have enough dignity to apologize on behalf of the United States and not diminish the men and women who work for Homeland Security, and I will not take a back seat to my advocacy for those individuals. But I am willing to apologize because this is an ill-conceived, cruel, inhumane, and ineffective way to govern our immigration laws. If you have suggested that I have, as a member of Congress, written some law that gives the permission for separation of children, there is no print to that. It is the way it is enacted. Policies are what causes that. It is my intent, Mr. Chairman, to put into the record, nobody opened the door rally, neighbors rally during an ICE raid in Houston, Texas, asked unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Asked unanimous consent for an article from the Chronicle. Houston Congresswoman said undocumented immigrants could seek shelter in churches during raids, asked unanimous consent.
Without objection.
And another about the mayor of the city of Houston weighs in on an expected ICE raid. None of this is to violate the law. It is only to recognize that we can enforce the law, but we do not have to be perpetrators of injustice, and we do not have to duplicate those adversaries in places where many of us know despotic leadership like Russia. We don't have to be Russia. We can be the United States of America, a great country, respecting you and all of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I thank you for having us in this hearing, and we have a lot of work to do in Washington, D.C. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Houston, Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to compliment you for bringing this hearing to this college. I compliment you because, Mr. Chairman, I've been in Congress since 2005. And to be very honest, there are not many chairpersons who would hold this hearing about this topic at this time. You deserve an expression of appreciation. I compliment you. I compliment you, Mr. Chairman. I compliment you. I compliment. I want to close with this. There were indications that the immigrants are not a threat, that there was not a local request for aid and assistance. There was no invitation from the local constabulary to have this take place. It seems to me that in targeting, we ought to at least, before we perfect a raid of this type, talk to the local sheriff. He might have information about the crimes that are being committed. Talk to the mayor. He might have an opinion about the crimes that are being committed. So I just hope that this will help us and you as you proceed with future endeavors. My hope is that you'll give some consideration to the local population before you do this again. And I'll close with this. I love my country. I say the Pledge of Allegiance. I sing the national anthem. Nobody is going to say that I'm not a patriotic American with any degree of credibility. And as a patriotic American, as you are, Mr. Miles, as you are, Mr. Lee, Sheriff Lee, as you are, Mayor, I say to you, this kind of behavior is totally unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank my colleagues for coming to Mississippi for this hearing. I want to thank the people who came today to the hearing. Your presence speaks volumes for your interest in this issue. I'm convinced that over time we'll fix this problem. As all my colleagues have said, we are a greater country than this. We should not, under any circumstance, separate children from their parents. I'm a grandparent. I know how precious young people are. I would not take pride in this country that separates its children. We're better than that. So I know people have a job to do, and it's a difficult job, but you can do it with compassion. And I think it's the compassion or lack of in this situation and some others that causes us concern. So we'll continue to conduct rigorous oversight. We will get back to the witnesses on it. I have some statements I'd like to acknowledge for the record from the Southern Poverty Law Center, the National Immigration Law Center, the Mississippi Immigrants' Right Alliance, the Mississippi Immigrants' Right Alliance Legal Project, Mississippi Center for Justice, Center for Law and Society, Community Change Action, Southeast Immigration Rights Network, as well as testimonies from people who are still incarcerated, who shared their letters with us. We've redacted some of the information, but their stories on what they've gone through since August is gut-wrenching at best. I want to thank, again, all of our witnesses. You shared the information. We take this back. We take it seriously. We'll do all we can, and hopefully we'll fix some of this, but we need to get it on the record. So again, the members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
All right. Benny, give you a kiss. Thank you, sir. All right. By way of my hand, sir.